Krista had barely pulled out of the driveway when the silence settled in. That heavy kind of quiet you feel more than hear, like a curtain dropped between rooms. She'd stopped by with a grocery bag of frozen vegetables and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just checking in," she said, setting down a box of dry cereal and mentioning something about the fridge light flickering. "Might be worth checking the fuse box just in case." I'd nodded, thanked her, watched her reverse down the gravel in that spotless white SUV Jeremy bought last spring. Her hair was perfectly parted, her lipstick too precise for a casual visit. Still, I chalked it up to habit. Krista was always polished, even when she lied. I turned toward the kitchen, meaning to put the groceries away, when Rex let out a sharp bark. Then another, then a low, guttural growl. He stood rigid by the doortail, stiff eyes locked on me. "Rex, what's gotten into you?" I said softly, but my hand trembled as I reached for the counter. He barked again this time, lunging toward me. Teeth bared, not in threat, but desperation. Then he bit my sleeve gently, but firmly, and tugged. I didn't argue. I don't know why. Maybe it was the look in his eyes. Maybe it was something colder in my chest I hadn't noticed yet. I followed him. He yanked me out onto the porch with more force than I thought his old legs could manage. And then it happened. The blast cracked through the morning stillness like a thunderclap. The ground lurched. Heat seared the back of my neck as the windows blew out in a hail of glass. Flames shot up from the side of the house, my home. I fell to my knees in the gravel, coughing, covering Rex with my arms as debris rained down. When I turned, gasping, the utility room was already engulfed in fire. That was where the fuse box was. The same fuse box Krista had just mentioned. I sat on the curb, gravel biting into my palms, smoke curling around us like a second skin. Rex trembled under my hand, pressed so close his fur was damp from my sweat. My ears rang. The sirens hadn't arrived yet, but the silence had a sound of its own. A high, thin whine like something breaking far away. I should have gone back inside. That's what anyone would have done, check for papers, photos, medication. But something about the way Rex had pulled me out, it was like he knew. And deep in my bones, something inside me knew too. Krista's hug had lingered longer than usual. Too long. Her hands had gripped my arms like she was saying goodbye, not see you next week. She'd looked at me with that same soft pity she used when I forgot a name or asked the same question twice. "You ever think about putting your valuables in a bank box?" she'd asked, fiddling with her car keys. God forbid anything ever happens. She'd said it casually offhand, but now it sat in my mind like a ticking clock. She'd looked at the cabinet near the hallway where I kept the old documents, Peter's medals, the deed. And then, as if remembering something important, she'd turned back at the door and said, "Oh, before I forget, the fridge light was flickering. You might want to check the fuse box." That fuse box. That was the part of the house that was gone first. The fire trucks finally arrived, breaking the stillness with their roar. Men in heavy gear jumped out, pulling hoses and shouting. Someone asked me if anyone else was inside. I shook my head. Another voice asked what happened. I opened my mouth to speak and realized I didn't know what I was allowed to believe yet. I just kept my hand on Rex's head and nodded through the questions. Smoke clung to my tongue, but I swallowed it down. They said it looked like it started near the wiring, maybe faulty connections. But the fire had moved fast. Too fast. I called them 3 times before the shock wore off enough to count. Once when the firefighters rolled out their ladders again, when they started tearing into the blackened walls, and a 3rd time when they asked if I had family nearby. No answer. Not from Jeremy. Not from Krista. Not even a text. The shelter they sent me to was clean enough. A cot, a thermal blanket, a lukewarm cup of instant coffee. Rex lay curled at my feet, still shaking. I kept my coat wrapped around him. It smelled like smoke now. Everything did. It was dark by the time they showed up. Krista came in first, mascara already smudged like she'd started crying in the car. "Oh, Iris," she whispered, rushing to hug me. Her arms were tight around my back. Too tight. Again. Jeremy followed behind, slower. He didn't sit, just stood near the door, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room like he had somewhere better to be. "I tried to grab your documents," Krista said, pulling away and dabbing her eyes. But the smoke was already so thick, I didn't know what to do. I nodded, even though she never said she'd gone inside. No mention of when she saw the smoke. No explanation of where she'd been the whole day. "I'll help with the insurance forms," she added. "I know all that paperwork can be overwhelming." Jeremy shifted. "We'll get through this, Mom." His voice was flat. Not cruel, just detached, like someone reciting lines they didn't rehearse. Later that evening, one of the investigators stopped by. A younger man, polite but direct. He crouched near my cot and spoke quietly. "We found the origin point," he said, "near the electrical panel in the rear utility room. It doesn't look accidental. There's a pattern in the wiring that suggests deliberate tampering. Small, but enough to spark something." I thanked him without looking up, just kept stroking Rex's ears. I didn't tell him what Krista said about the fuse box. Not yet. I needed to know how far this went before I said a word. The investigator met me outside the cordoned-off remains the next morning. The air still smelled of burned insulation and wet ash. Curious neighbors slowed their cars as they passed, but no one stopped long enough to speak. Rex stayed close to my leg, his tail low, as if the ground itself still held heat. "We've cleared the edges," the investigator said, lifting the yellow tape so I could duck under. "Just watch your step." The house looked smaller now, collapsed in on itself like a rib cage after the lungs had gone. I followed him toward what used to be the hallway. The floor was a mosaic of charred wood, shattered tile, and unrecognizable debris. The investigator pointed with his flashlight. This was the utility room. Origin points definitely here. He crouched beside a twisted patch of metal and broken shelving, what remained of the old cabinet that had stood there since before Jeremy was born. I stared at the blackened outline on the wall, the faint shape of where the cabinet had once been bolted. "There should have been a fireproof box here," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Metal. Heavy. It wouldn't melt." He sifted through the ash with a gloved hand. A few screws, a warped hinge, a piece of tin siding, but nothing resembling the thick steel box I'd bought after Peter passed. If it was here, he said it should still be visible. Even heat like this wouldn't fully destroy it. I nodded, but my stomach tightened. I'd left that box in the bottom drawer just days ago. Inside were every deed we ever signed, Peter's pension papers, our marriage certificate, and the newest version of my will. The investigator continued cataloging fragments while I stepped back, breathing through the bitter smell. I didn't tell him the box had been too heavy to move without effort. I didn't say Krista had looked directly at that hallway cabinet yesterday. Instead, I knelt and touched the scorched soil, letting my fingers hover over where the box should have been. There was no trace. I stood slowly, brushing ash from my hands, already knowing who I needed to speak to next. 2 days later, I knocked on Lorraine Halberd's door. She lived across the street and slightly uphill, prime view of my driveway from her front porch. I'd brought a tin of oatmeal cookies I found at the shelter's snack table just to make it seem casual. She invited me in, ushered me past her cats, and offered lukewarm tea I didn't want. "I'm so sorry about the fire, Iris. Just awful. But thank God you got out in time." "Lorraine," I said, setting the tin down, "your door camera. Does it keep recordings?" She blinked, surprised. "Sure does. My son installed it last year after the package thefts. It's motion triggered, but it catches everything coming and going." She pulled up the app on her tablet, scrolling back through thumbnails until she found the morning of the fire. There was Krista's SUV pulling in just after 9. She got out alone, no grocery bags, just her purse. Lorraine tapped again. Then came the second clip, Krista leaving 25 minutes later. And in her hands was something else, a black rectangular object, heavier than a purse held with both arms. She paused before getting into her SUV, adjusted it in her grip, then drove off. Time stamped 9:41 a.m. The fire was reported at 9:49. I kept my voice steady as I asked Lorraine to email the clip to me. She did without question. Said something about how odd it seemed now, how Krista didn't even wave goodbye that morning. I thanked her and walked home, if I could call the shelter cot home. The air was damp and cold, and Rex limped slightly from an old injury flaring up. I carried him the last block without a word. That evening I called the lawyer, not the one Krista knew about, but the one I'd quietly started working with months ago, when things started feeling off. He met me the next morning. His office smelled like dust and old books. When I asked if the documents I left were safe, he nodded and showed me the sealed file. I exhaled for the first time in days. But something else still burned behind my ribs. 3 days after visiting the lawyer, I ran into Norma Clay at the temporary assistance office. She'd worked at the credit union for nearly 20 years before retiring, and she still volunteered twice a week, helping seniors manage online banking. She hugged me tightly, murmured her condolences, then leaned closer in that way she had when she didn't want others to hear. I didn't see anything, she whispered, but I heard something. Your son's joint account with Krista. It shows a new deposit, a big one. Day after the fire, my breath thinned. Norma, you shouldn't be telling me that. I know, she said, but I also know you, Iris. And I know when something doesn't smell right. She walked off before I could question her further, leaving me with a silence heavier than any legal binder. Later that afternoon, while filling out emergency housing forms, I let my mind drift back to a conversation from weeks earlier. Krista had been chopping vegetables in my kitchen, her tone light, her words almost playful. Jeremy and I worry about you, she'd said. It's not safe living alone at your age. Maybe it's time to think about other arrangements. Other arrangements. The kind that required removing me first. I replayed her sudden interest in my documents, her careful questions about my will, her insistence that the flickering fridge light meant I should check the fuse box, her absence the morning of the fire, and now a large, unexplained deposit into their account. The pieces didn't form a full picture yet, but their edges aligned far too neatly to ignore. That evening, I sat on the shelter cot, Rex's head resting on my knee, and thought about what to do next. Grief wanted to swallow me whole, but something deeper, older, rose instead. A steadiness I hadn't felt since Peter died. I had always handled crises quietly. This would be no different. I pulled out my small notebook, the one I used for grocery lists and reminders, and began writing down names, dates, details. Not for revenge, for clarity, for protection. By the time the lights dimmed for the night, I knew exactly where I needed to go in the morning. The next morning, I returned to the lawyer's office, the same one where I'd seen the sealed file tucked away in the cabinet, marked Colton Iris. He greeted me with a quiet nod, ushered me into the back room without small talk. I think he could sense something had shifted since our last meeting. I want to make an amendment, I said, settling into the worn leather chair across from his desk, to the estate clause. He clicked his pen. Go ahead. I want it written that any insurance payouts related to the fire are to be held until the cause is officially confirmed by a third-party investigator, not just the insurance company's adjuster. He looked up surprised, but didn't question me. I can draft that now. As he typed, I took a breath and added, also, I've filed a formal request for secondary investigation through the fire marshal's office. Quietly. Based on new information. He nodded again, slower this time, fingers still moving over the keys. When he finished, he printed a copy for me to sign. My hands didn't tremble this time. Not even a little. On the walk back to the shelter, my phone buzzed. A message from Krista lit up the screen. "Krista, thinking of you today. Hope the insurance stuff is moving along. How are the repairs coming?" Repairs. She wrote it like the house had a cracked gutter, not a blown-out foundation. I stared at her message for a long time. Didn't reply. Instead, I walked to the edge of the parking lot, leaned against a wooden railing, and watched Rex sniff around the fence line. The sky had cleared, but the air still carried the faintest scent of ash. It didn't leave. Not fully. By that evening, the fire marshal had acknowledged my request. "We'll assign someone to review your claim," and the footage, the message said. "This may take time." That was fine. I had time. I had records. And for the first time since the blast, I had control. The next morning, I overheard Krista saying something she didn't know I'd hear. The shelter had quiet hours in the late afternoon, when most people were out meeting with caseworkers or searching for temporary rentals. I usually used that time to sit with Rex in the small courtyard, letting him wander the patch of worn grass. But that day, I went back inside to look for a misplaced notebook. The hallway was empty. At least it seemed so. Then I heard her voice. Krista's laugh carried before the words did, sharp and bright, in a space where people usually whispered. She stood near the vending machine, her back-to-me phone pressed to her ear. "No, she won't be able to stay in that place anymore," she said, her tone feather-light. Guess the universe made it easier. A pause, then another laugh, louder this time. Careless. Almost triumphant. I stopped in the shadow of the doorway. My heartbeat slowed, not sped up. It was strange how clarity worked. It didn't rush in with panic, but settled like dust, soft and undeniable. Krista went on, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial murmur. "It's sad, sure, but things happen for a reason. And Jeremy's had enough on his plate. This simplifies things." I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't let the door creak. I slipped my phone out of my pocket, tapped record, and held it close to my side. Her voice carried easily in the empty hall. She ended the call a minute later, sighing dramatically before heading toward the exit. I stepped back around the corner until her footsteps faded. Only once she was gone did I exhale. It wasn't proof of arson, not on its own, but it was proof of something just as telling intention, or at least satisfaction. Enough to paint a clearer picture when added to everything else. That evening, in the shelter's computer room, I listened to the recording again, then forwarded it to my lawyer with a short message, "Add this to the file." He responded within minutes. Received. I closed the laptop and rested my hand on Rex's back. He nudged my knee gently, sensing the tension I hadn't spoken aloud. I didn't confront Krista. I didn't confront Jeremy either. There would be a time for words, but not yet. The next day, news came from the insurance company. The call came before noon. I was folding a pile of donated clothes at the edge of my cot when Jeremy's number lit up the screen. I hesitated before answering, already bracing for the tone I knew too well. "Mom," he said. Too cheerful, too fast. "Krista and I just left the insurance office. Looks like there's a delay with the payout. Something about needing further review." I didn't say anything. His voice tightened. "They said someone filed a hold request. Did you do something?" Before I could reply, another voice cut in, Krista, not bothering to hide the irritation. "You're turning a simple accident into some kind of witch hunt. For what attention control?" I still didn't respond. There was nothing worth defending. "You know they were going to issue the check this week," she went on. "Now it's frozen. We're dealing with enough Iris." The call ended without a goodbye. I sat still for a while after that, letting Rex nudge his head under my hand. The building buzzed with quiet movement, meals being served, volunteers organizing linens, but my mind stayed on the silence that followed her voice. That evening, just after dinner, I received a call from the fire marshal's office. Iris Colton, the voice asked. Yes. This is Investigator Reeves. We've completed our secondary review of the site and footage. Based on what we've found, we believe there's cause to escalate the case. There are indications of deliberate tampering with the electrical system. Possibly targeted. He paused as if waiting for my reaction. But I had none left to give. We'll be issuing a formal statement to the insurer. You may be contacted again during the process. Understood, I said. After hanging up, I turned off the overhead light and sat in the quiet dark. My hands rested on Rex's back, his breath slow, steady. The anger was no longer hot. It had cooled into something still rooted. They had lit the match. And now the smoke was curling back toward them. The next morning, I found Krista in the hallway again, this time with her voice raised just enough for everyone to hear. By the time autumn touched the trees, the investigation had ended. The fire was ruled intentional, not an accident, not faulty wiring or an old circuit. Tampering. Specific. Controlled. That was the word they used. Controlled like it had all been part of a careful, cruel plan. The insurance company froze the claim indefinitely. There was talk of legal charges, but no arrest. Not yet. Just a trail of paperwork, recorded calls, and silence thick enough to choke. Jeremy and Krista moved out of state. No announcement, no farewell. Just gone one day. Their mail forwarded, their number disconnected. I heard from a neighbor that they'd listed their house. Quietly took a loss just to leave quickly. I didn't ask why. I already knew. I signed a lease on a small trailer near the edge of the old property, temporary, but mine. Rex and I walked the perimeter every morning, boots crunching over scorched earth and frost-dusted grass. The house was gone, but the land remained. The pension came in steady, untouched. The deed had never left my name. The will, the titles, the documents all safe in the lawyer's office, where Krista's hands had never reached. One morning, while clearing the space where the porch used to be, Rex began pawing at the dirt near the old oak. I thought it was nothing. Maybe a buried toy, a root. But he kept digging until something small and blackened emerged. A ring box. It was warped from heat, the velvet singed and stiff, but when I pried it open, the gold band inside was whole. My husband's wedding ring. The one I thought lost in the fire. I held it for a long time, turning it between my fingers as the wind pressed against my coat. Rex sat beside me, quiet and steady. The house had burned. The walls, the roof, the framed photos all gone. But this place, this ground, this stubborn circle of gold, it had survived. I stood, slowly brushed the dirt from my palms, and looked out across the land that still remembered me. Then I took the first step toward building something new.